I also just made some coffee, but my coffee is too hot. Too hot. So I have to wait. I have a cat's tongue, which means I do not eat, or I don't, well, eat or drink anything if it's super hot. So I have to wait for it to cool off a little bit. Oh, hold on. Okay, why am I getting notifications? Let's stop that. Okay, so this has been kind of a crazy week. I missed Sunday's live, which I think I'm only going to do one live each week. It's going to be on Wednesdays, 9 o'clock Eastern time. That's the new live time, because doing 2 in a week, it felt like it would be easier, but it actually wasn't easier. Maya, hi, how are you? Oh, I haven't seen you or heard from you in forever. We will have to talk. We will have to talk after this. But yeah, so we've had a crazy week. Alex was in a school play. The play was like 4 events in a row. So it was 3 days. One of the days had 2 showings. So he had 4 plays to do in a row. And our introverted self did not like that. So he did a great job. So like overall, that part was fine. But at the end of every show, and I went to 3 of the 4 shows. I didn't go to the matinee, but I went to the evening shows. Alex was ready to go. As soon as we finished, like, you know, the first day, I'm like, okay, I'm going to give him a hug, tell him how great he did. And he was like, thanks, Mom. Let me go change. And he would leave, he would change, he would come back out and be like, take me home. And at first I thought he was like angry or upset. Maybe he thought he did a horrible job. No, he was just introvert self. It was too loud. And then, as you can imagine, at the end of the show is when the cheering happens, the roaring, like it gets significantly louder. So he just, my introverted son, and he's not as introverted as I am, but after 4 days, especially, or 4 showings, he was exhausted and ready to go. And so I was exhausted as well, being in public that long, which is so weird to me. It's so weird because you know, military life, you kind of cannot be an introvert, I don't think, as a service member. You just can't. So there were many times where I just pushed my way through it. But now that I'm retired, I don't do that anymore. Okay, but today's topic of conversation, before I go off on too much of a tangent, is Mexico versus Europe. Where should you live? What's the differences between the two? We're going to start off with what I think is an obvious premise, but I think it matters. It bears saying, which is it's a personal decision. Hey, morning, John. Morning from New Jersey. So yeah, it's a personal decision. Yeah. Moving to a location, it's personal. So for some people, they'll prefer Europe. Some people, they'll prefer Mexico. Other people will prefer other parts of the world because the world is a pretty large place to live. So I'm not suggesting that there's only one answer to this question, just that there are pros and cons for every location. There's no such thing as a perfect place. And I think it bears chatting about. I hear people asking this question, you know. I think Portugal has become a huge thing from the Europe viewpoint. A lot of people wanting to move to Portugal. So then they ask, you know, should I attempt Portugal or Mexico? And I think right now we're in a season of, although I think Mexico's kind of coming out of it, to be honest, but we're in a season of feeling like before we can move to Mexico, we have to get residency, right? So Mexico traditionally gave 180 days, but now on a whim, it feels like on a whim, they could just not give you 180. So a lot of people are like, well, maybe we should just attempt residency before we even go to Mexico, you know, just to have it. And likewise, Portugal, which is part of the Schengen region, right? You can only be there for 90 days. That's your max. And that's not just Portugal. That's for all of the Schengen region of Europe. You can only be there 90 days. So there's this element of, we might as well, hey, Francie, we might as well get residency before we go to Portugal, even if we've never been there. So these are kind of big decisions. But we'll backtrack a little bit. It feels big. It's not necessarily as big as you think it is. I think it's fine. Mentally, it's weird, right? Paying so much to move to Portugal, only being there 90 days. And then you have to come back to the US to start the visa process if you do decide you love Portugal. And I understand. Yes, totally. But there's other ways to live in Europe if you need to. And so, say, similar to Mexico, you could get residency before ever coming to Mexico. It's harder to do for a lot of people, but you could do it. But this feeling of urgency, this feeling of I have to get residency or I have to choose only one place, I think we can calm down, honestly. We just pick the place where you think you most likely would prefer to go there when you can. You have permission to leave that location. And what we've talked about this in past lives and in past videos, an expat, a traveler, has to travel. Like, it's very rare for a traveler to pick their perfect spot the first time. Very, very rare. And so you want to recognize that the place you choose, even though it might be perfect for you, we don't know yet, could be perfect for you, might also not be perfect for you. And you might not know it until you've tried a couple places. You might start in Portugal, move to Mexico, or move to Italy, or move to some other place, and then come back to Portugal because you realize, no, really, Portugal is the best place for me. Lots of friends I have start in Merida, Mexico, right? Safest city in Mexico, but then they move out, they branch out, and a lot of them go back to Mexico, or sorry, they go back to Merida, Mexico, because they realize afterwards, like, oh, I thought it was missing something. I felt like it was missing something, but it wasn't, right? Or it wasn't missing what I thought it was missing. Right? The grass is not always greener on the other side. So much can happen. I don't think you necessarily need to worry about residency immediately. You just go to one, continue moving. So the stress we put on ourselves, not as important. I want to mention that up front, right before we even get into the specifics of certain countries, because how to phrase it? Sometimes the visa requirements, let's say, for a country is intimidating and it makes you not want to deal with it, or it makes you want to deal with it early on, like head straight into that residency, get it out of the way. And I don't think we need to look at the world as black and white. Look at the world as, this is the only place I must put forth all energy to move here. We can keep traveling. I'm here. I don't know if you can hear him, but every time Henry licks his lips or his beard, I don't know exactly what he's trying to lick. I can hear it, so it's in the background. So a little bit about me, in case you don't know that much about me. Hi, I'm Anne. I am a single mom and also dog owner, and I'm currently part-time living in this RV, which I love. Part-time in the RV, but honestly, most of the time living with my dad here in Georgia. So that's where we currently are. We just returned from 3 years in Mexico. Year and a half in Merida, year and a half in San Cris. And so that's where we were most recently. But before that, before Mexico life, I lived in this RV, but before that, I was in the military. And so I've traveled to a lot of different places. I was also a military brat, so I traveled to a lot of places even as a kid. And as far as Europe is concerned, I lived 2 years in Naples, Italy. So there's a duty station there. So I was stationed in Naples, Italy for 2 years, working with NATO. And because I was working with NATO, I had the honor of traveling to various other NATO and, I forget the phrase, but countries that want to be part of NATO. So I got to travel to various other countries to help them establish joining NATO. And I'm speaking as if I'm a key player. I was a comms girl. Part of joining the NATO is proving that you're able to do certain wickets, that you're able to help out. And so I would go there just to test their comms, essentially, and see if it's up to the standard that NATO requires. And then I would have other times going to places that are already NATO countries to confirm and to learn how NATO likes things to be run. So I got to travel, is my point, but I only lived in Italy, visited many other countries. And so that's kind of my basis, if you will, for even discussing these different countries and even discussing kind of my viewpoint on it, just as a background. But again, so we're going to start talking about the nitty-gritty. But before we talk about the nitty-gritty, let me know, what countries have you lived in, and or what countries have you visited? Because I think if you think back to the countries you've lived in or the places that you visited, even if you were only there for a weekend, you'll start to understand maybe some of the things we're going to dissect in terms of where might be a great place for you to start and possibly finish your travel journey, if that's something that you're thinking about doing. So the primary focus is going to be definitely Mexico versus Europe, but really these topics kind of apply to a lot of places. I will say it occurred to me to do Latin America versus Europe, but one, I don't have experience in Latin America, right? My experience really for the Latin American countries is 99% Mexico. I've done a little bit of island hopping in the Caribbean areas, but basically it's Mexico. And so I thought it would be disingenuous for me to speak too much about the other Latin countries. Conceptually, it might make sense, but I don't know enough to really talk about it. So it made more sense to go Mexico versus Europe, even though Europe obviously is multiple countries, not just one country, right? John says med school in Guadalajara, Mexico, 3 years. I think it's awesome when people go to other countries specifically for school. I just find that fascinating. I think it's a great way to kind of like immerse yourself in that new location, right? If you go as a visitor, if you go just to move there, you control how much you immerse yourself. So if you're an introvert like myself, you can slow it down as much as you want. But if you go for work and if you go for schooling, you're kind of forced to integrate a little bit more. So very, very cool that John got to do that. All right. I covered that. So reasons why you might choose one over the other. One is diversity. This is a tricky word. It's right up there with the word safety, actually. It's a tricky word to kind of talk about. But obviously, if you move to Mexico, you are going to be mingling with other Mexicans, as well as obviously the travelers, etc. But you're going to be dealing with Mexico. If you go to Europe, you're going to be dealing with a variety of countries, even if you only choose one. So we're going to choose Italy, since that's where my focus is, or where I lived for 2 years. You're going to move to Italy, let's say. That's going to be your location. In theory, you're going to be dealing only with Italians, but part of the fun reality is everything's international. And so you're going to get a higher international rate in Europe generally than you will in Mexico / North America. Higher amount, no matter which country. So Europe, obviously, multiple countries already, but they're literally so close together that you will get a mix of other countries, even if you only choose one country in Europe. To give you a visual concept, Europe is, I think, 3.9 million square miles. 3.9 million square miles, like the gist of Europe, okay? The US is 3.5 million square miles. Okay, so we're not much small. The entire country of the US is not much smaller than the entire Europe. And because of that, in the US, traveling from different states is easy. Not really. We don't have a mass transportation system, but theoretically, it's physically a certain length. In Europe, the mass transportation is just excellent. Also in Mexico, by the way. And they're close to each other. So it's easy enough to be like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to go to, France. Tomorrow I'm going to go to Germany. I'm going to be there just for the weekend and come back home. Like, that's a thing you can do when you're in Europe. In the US, unless you're on a border state, even going to Mexico could be a big deal because you might be in the north of the US. And so going to Mexico is not something like, oh, I'm going to just go there tomorrow and like hang out for a couple of days and come back. It's not impossible, but it's much more unlikely. So that diversity ease is not as much in North America as it is in Europe. And you'll notice that when you arrive there. You'll notice, even if you're not in a touristy area necessarily, there's just a little bit more diversity in Europe. And again, if you're traveling different parts of Europe, you're going to be able to hit different countries, whereas Mexico, I'm trying to remember the number. If I recall correctly, the size of Italy is the size of, I think, Georgia and Florida together. And Italy is 1/7 the size of Mexico. So, or it might be more, it might be a tenth. But either way, Mexico is a significant portion. They're not as big as the US, but they're still, from a country perspective, they're significantly larger than a significant amount of places in Europe. So Europe, more diversity, literally because there's so many countries put together. They're very close to each other. The countries are physically small. And so they're small compared to the larger, certain countries, but small compared to the US, right? So they're able to intermingle a lot easier than they can necessarily in a place like Mexico. So that's kind of the difference. If you want that, that's cool. If you're pondering polyglot, let's say, if you're pondering learning multiple languages, that's cool. right? Whereas if you go to Mexico, your focus will definitely be Spanish, right? You're not going to focus on French. You're going to focus on Spanish. There are many languages in Mexico, but with the exception of Spanish, all the other languages tend to be very regional located, very community based, small communities. So they're not necessarily nationwide as much. Does that make sense? Whereas a good example is when I moved to Italy, I had no Italian experience. In school, high school and college, I learned French. So I would walk around Italy speaking really bad French, by the way. Like a native French speaker would definitely have scoffed at me. But I would speak French in Italy and it would work. Why? Because the languages are similar enough. There's a lot of similarities between the two. But Italians are also used to hearing other European languages. They also did okay with English, to be honest. English is in a lot of places, but they're able to communicate with that a lot more. Mexico, strong on the Spanish side, right? Although Mexicans are very, very forgiving if you speak bad Spanish, which I appreciate. So you've got the diversity concept, higher cost of living. Overall, Europe is going to cost more than Mexico. So if you're on a budget, if you're on a very strict budget especially, and if you don't know of a way to fluctuate that, to increase that as needed, then I would lean towards Mexico, because definitely the cost of living is much lower. That being said, there are parts of Mexico that's definitely higher cost of living, so you want to keep that in mind. But generally speaking, Europe is expensive, even compared to the US. So there are parts of Europe that are distinctly more expensive than the US. Again, one of the reasons why Portugal tends to be popular is, one, it's supposed to be a little bit easier to get a visa, but two, cost of living in Portugal is considered lower. That being said, it's lower in comparison to other European countries and only slightly lower in comparison to the US. So the overhead to move to Portugal, let's say, is probably going to be significant. Significant compared to the overhead to move to Mexico. So if you're on a budget, from a US perspective, especially, hands down, it's going to be Mexico. It's cheaper to go there physically, right? You don't have to fly over across the Atlantic, and cost of living in Mexico, much more affordable. I saw some comments come in. Let me grab them real quick because they were too long for me to read. Okay, Francie says she's traveled to lots of places, EU, Asia, Mexico, loved it all. Travel is the best. Like, observing humans is the best. Found shared human connection everywhere. People are amazing all over, but our plan is Mexico, as is accessible via car. Yes. Much more, again, affordable to come to Mexico with your car. You can theoretically go to Europe with your car. Much harder. Much harder. And of course, much more expensive. And then John says, want to improve your Spanish, get a Mexican girlfriend who doesn't speak any English. I've tried getting a Mexican girlfriend. No, I'm joking. But yes, if you've got someone that you that can only speak Spanish and that you really want to communicate with, motivation is hugely effective, right? So having a girlfriend or boyfriend is helpful. Better than Berlitz. I'm not 100% what that means, John. What is Berlitz? Oh, hold on. Open. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so I will say, definitely having friends who cannot speak English / whatever language that you naturally speak, very helpful. Same for work. I think if you work in an environment that is constantly speaking that other language, you're going to pick it up, because not only are you hearing it all the time, but the motivation is there, right? The necessity to kind of join that community will definitely help. Definitely. Seasonally, so Europe has many more. I don't know if many more is accurate. Europe has colder seasons than Mexico generally. Like, if you look on the map, they're further north, whereas Mexico's further south, right, closer to the equator. So Europe is going to have the colder weather. So if you are a fan of colder weather, Europe is probably the route to go, whereas Mexico, definitely more known for warm. Even in San Cristobal, which is elevated, so it's cooler, it was not cold. I was not worried about like snow. It did hail, by the way, a few times. We did have like random hailstorms, but I wasn't really worried about snow in San Cris. So there's still a warmth to Mexico, I think, pretty much no matter where you go. Whereas in Europe, I mean, we already know the further north you go in Europe, the colder it gets. I lived in Italy. Italy definitely had the hottest season, which is August, and then the colder seasons. Like it got the dramatic levels. So you can freeze and you can burn because it's got all 4 seasons, generally speaking, no matter which country you choose in Europe. Whereas Mexico definitely leans more towards warm, which is what it's known for. So maybe you have a preference for a particular season, and or you might have a medical condition that requires you to be in a certain season more than others. And I know a lot of people actually that move to Mexico specifically because it's warmer than the US and their bodies physically needed it, as opposed to a preference, I guess, if that makes sense. So weather is warmer in Mexico, much colder in Europe. And related to that, right, that cost of living concept, if you're in a location that has basically the same weather all year round, you're going to have minimal clothing requirements. So you might still have a puffy jacket, you might have a couple of warm items, but most of your clothing will be summery, which tends to be less expensive than winter clothing. So again, touching that cost of living avenue or that concept, Mexico is cheaper in a lot of ways, more affordable in a lot of ways for multitudes of reasons, right? So there's that lower cost of living, has seasons. Europe is going to have your seasons, and travel with pets. Again, you absolutely can move to Europe with a pet, but it's a much longer flight, much bigger deal, much more cost concern. So for me, I will say traveling with a pet is so much more stressful than traveling with a kid, than traveling, of course, by myself. And so there's a mental, like, when I go to Europe, and I do plan on going to Europe again, it's not going to be for a weekend. It's not going to be for an insignificant period of time. It's going to be for a long period of time, partially because I might as well. It's a significant distance away, so I might as well stay in the region for a significant period of time. But also because this dog does not like to travel, does not like to be in a vehicle for very long. This does include the RV. Does not like to travel in a plane for very long. And so I don't want him to have to repeatedly go through that experience over and over again. I do also lean, and I don't think this is necessarily a right or wrong answer, but there are people who never travel with their pets. They leave their pets with a trusted agent, right? Family or whoever. And there's nothing wrong with that. But also, how many people do you know that have left their pets with their mom or whoever, and they never get the pet back because the pet forms a bond with whoever you leave the pet with, right? So to me, so long as I want to have a pet, he needs to travel with me. If I leave him for months and months at a time, he essentially could become someone else's pet. So that's one of those decisions you make for a larger trip like Europe is, are we going to be pet owners? Are we not? It will be harder to take your pet to Europe than to Mexico, and likewise harder to return back. Not hard enough to stop you if you want to have a pet, but just saying, slightly more stress, right? So especially if you're new to traveling and if you are new to traveling with pets, again, Mexico from a US standpoint would be significantly easier than going all the way to Europe. Now, that being said, once you're in Europe, mass transportation, etc., is actually pretty, it's easy. Similar to Mexico. Mexico's mass transportation is amazing. Europe, from what I recall, and maybe things have changed because of COVID, I don't know for sure, but it used to be really easy to travel with your pet, meaning your pet could travel in a bus. Your pet could travel on a plane. So double check those rules before we make that a firm commitment. But used to be very easy. Whereas in Mexico, if you don't know, traveling with a pet, you can definitely fly with a pet to most places, but you can't just get on an ADO bus with a dog. Their interpretation of like support dogs is very, very limited. So I think if you're blind, they'll consider your dog Like if your dog is there to help you with blindness, that's considered acceptable. So you can get on a bus with that kind of a scenario. But there are many other scenarios that people might need a dog for, or might need a support animal for, that Mexico, from bus perspective, does not recognize. So keep that in mind. Europe might accept that a little more easily than Mexico would. Pros and cons. Depends on how you want to travel with your dog. Again, my dog does not like to go on bus trips, does not like to do those things anyway. So while it was a negative in Mexico that I couldn't necessarily travel with the dog via bus, he would not have taken those bus rides very well anyway. So, if it's a short trip, Henry was going to be taken care of by somebody else. Vice coming with us. That's his name, by the way, Henry. Okay. Visas. I might get in trouble for these comments, but here we go anyway. So Mexico, for an American, we can land and get 180 days as a tourist. It is automatic. It's not something you have to apply for. That being said, yes, especially in recent years, they've gotten a little more strict. Not strict. I don't even know if strict is the right word. A little more sporadic with giving you the 180 days versus 7 days versus 12 days, 90 days. There's been some inconsistencies with the amount of days tourists have been getting, which is why a lot of people have been pondering, should I just go ahead and get in residency, at least 1 year residency, to kind of guarantee how long we can stay in Mexico. I think that is slowly ebbing away to where we can maybe start predicting 180. But more important than that, I think, is Mexico does not treat people who are over their 180 days like a criminal. Okay? It's a very weird thing to think of. And there's an element of, just because they don't consider it a criminal doesn't mean we should think it's okay. I will let you interpret that how you want to, but the type, because I also have temporary Mexico residency, the type of residency I got required that I be in the red, required that my FMM be expired before I can apply for it in country, because I applied in country. So there are, and this happens in the US, by the way, also, we actually have some residency related visas or citizenship that will allow you to be a citizen in the US, but you have to be expired first. Mentally great, like it's crazy to think about. But Mexico is in that same line where they don't think of you as a criminal just because you're over the 180 days. Yes, it is possible to be deported if you're over 180 days, but it is more likely that you will pay a slight fine and they don't and in 3 days you can come back, right? Hold on one second. So it's less likely that you are going to get a lifetime ban if the only crime you committed, if you will, is that you're over the 180 / over the 90 days, etc. There are a variety of ways to extend it. Extension is not guaranteed. You should not assume that that's a thing they'll do for you, but there are ways to extend it as well. And like I said, I got residency because a requirement for the residency I got was that my FMM is expired. And it did not matter how many days my FMM was expired. So I, being military, am a little more paranoid about having an expired visa, especially because I was traveling with my son, right? So I did not want to put Alex in a situation where years from now he's trying to get a security clearance and they're like, hey, looks like in Mexico you stayed over the time limit, and for him to be like, I was a kid. I don't control my time limit. So I was very careful with how many days Alex was expired. So I think our visas expired like May 28th, let's say. And then our visa appointment was June 2nd or June 1st, one of those two. So we were expired for only a handful of days because I didn't want to risk anything crazy happening. But that being said, I know a significant amount of people who have years expired FMMs who are waiting for, because again, that's one requirement for residency, but there are other things, who are waiting for all the things to align to get residency in Mexico. And can they travel in and out of Mexico with this expired scenario? I mean, they could definitely travel out, but they don't travel through Mexico, meaning they don't leave the state that they're in because crossing a border is the riskiest time. So that means it's illegal. But if they walk into, an immigration office, INM office, they're not going to go to jail that day. Not just for being expired. In fact, the INM office is most likely going to give them an option of how to correct. So maybe how to extend or get residency, or a safe passage out, meaning, do you want to fly out? Cool, we'll give you a letter so you can fly out and nobody will bother you, that kind of thing. So again, my point is Mexico, very fluid, very friendly towards these things. So does that kind of make sense? I don't want to imply that you can just stay as long as you want, because it's not entirely true. You definitely are stuck, if you will, in the state that you're in. And again, I know many people who are in that situation where they want residency, they don't meet all the requirements. Usually they can't afford to keep traveling in and out of the country every 6 months. So they don't. They just stay and wait for the other requirements to roll around. Usually they're financial requirements, because to get the 4-year residency that I got with Alex required not only that we're expired for at least 1 day, but we had to pay, I think, total. So not just to the Mexican government, but I had a liaison helping me. So total, it ended up being approximately $1,000 each. So almost $2,000 US. It was in pesos, so it depends on how that fluctuates. But at the time, it was almost 2,000, I believe. I have a whole video on it if you haven't seen it. But again, very fluid. Europe, especially the Schengen region of Europe. So I don't want to say all of Europe necessarily. Much more strict, to the day. If you go over so they allow 90 days in a 180-day period. For an American, at least when you visit, going over that 90 days could equal a ban. Sometimes for a short period of time, so maybe let's say a year, they just don't let you come back for a year. Other times, especially if you've done that same crime multiple times, we could be talking about a lifetime ban. So if your goal is to move, let's say to Portugal, you don't want to be getting a lifetime ban. You don't want to be in that kind of a scenario, right? So much more strict, much more by the book in Europe than in Mexico. So if you don't have the requirements to get residency, if that's your ultimate goal to get residency, / if you want to stay longer than 90 days, you have to follow these guidelines really strictly. Like, there is no, I couldn't afford it, so I just stayed an extra 90 days and we're good. No. Hey, Alicia. Much more strict in Europe. And so again, looking at your finances, looking at your life, if you think you can't afford that because Europe is already more expensive than Mexico, and you think you can't get residency via there's a lot of ways to get residency in Europe, but if you don't have any of those avenues, or you don't have an easy way to get it, maybe waiting in Mexico is the thing. And the reason why I bring Portugal is I feel like, especially in Merida, Portugal was like the next place a lot of people were going. Several people who wanted to leave the US, ultimately for Portugal and or Europe, they would actually take a year off and move to Mexico first, 6 months to a year off, move to Mexico while they get all the paperwork ready. So the visas are a process for Europe, and they didn't want to be in the US while that process was waiting. So they would move to Mexico first, enjoy Mexico in all its glory, right? While all the paperwork lined up, while all the finances lined up. A couple people were waiting to pay off a couple of debts. It's hard to pay off those debts in the US. They moved to Mexico so they could pay off the debts, so that then they'll have a better standard to move to where they kind of want to move to. And in this case, the people I spoke to were mostly going to Portugal. Again, because Portugal is also lower cost of living compared to a lot of locations in Europe. And they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to go there for 90 days and get kicked out, right? So they wanted their visa before ever setting foot in Portugal. Mexico was the place they went to temporarily to get their finances in order to move to Europe, which is another very popular thing. So again, your visas in Europe is not a joke, much more strict. That being said, from my perspective, if I were to go to Europe, I am unlikely to to get residency before I go. It's possible that I'll go to a particular place, love it so much, and get residency at that point, or attempt to start the residency process. But I'm just unlikely to get residency before going, which means, and I would want to stay longer than 90 days. But my method would be to choose a country. Albania to me is probably the easiest of those countries to live in. So Albania allows Americans to be there for 1 year. And during that year, I would take a 3-month visit, because I'm not a fan of like country hopping. It's not my thing. I like to go to one place and sit for a while. So my vision would be move to Albania for 1 year. In that 1 year time period, I could theoretically do it after, because again, I might fall in love with Albania. We don't know. But spend 3 months in Italy, probably in one city, because I can't imagine traveling to multiple cities in such a short period of time, just because of my travel style. But I would pick one location in Italy, stay there for 3 months, move back to Albania, stay there until I was ready. Stay there until I'm allowed back into Schengen, right? And then when I'm allowed back in, I would either pick a different city in Italy or a different country, depending on how things are going, right? But I would stay 3 months at a time. So 3 on, 3 off, 3 on, 3 off, essentially would be what I was doing. But that 3 off would need to be outside of the Schengen region. And so Albania would be a great choice, I think, for that, because Albania is also very close to all those places. So getting from Albania to the other countries wouldn't be as costly as, certainly not compared to moving all the way back to the US and then coming back, right? So that's probably the route that I would go. There are other countries. So I think Armenia and Georgia are also countries that allow you to have 1 year as an American without any particular paperwork. But those locations are further east Europe / Asia, right? They're in that border kind of region, which is probably how I would visit Asia, honestly, is start in Armenia / Georgia region and then ponder where I would want to go. One of the biggest reasons why you never hear me talking about Southeast Asia is because the amount of time they allow you to stay there is significantly shorter. It's like a month. And I can't even imagine learning a place in a month, because I like to sit there. I like to observe. I like to witness. This takes time. So a week in the Philippines will not make me feel like I understand the Philippines. I've visited, I think, 2 weeks Singapore. Very clean, beautiful place, but I don't feel like I can speak on Singapore because I was there for 2 weeks. Like, it's just, first impression, it's clean, definitely felt safe, but do I recommend it as a country to move to? I have no idea. Like, I know so little about it. Whereas I was stationed in Italy, which is why I was there for 2 years. So now I have some sense of Italy. And in fact, I make a lot of correlations between Italy and Mexico. Very, very many correlations between the two. Because I had time to sit there. I had time to observe the locals. I actually worked with, because I was part of NATO, my unit worked with about 50% Americans and a quarter German and a quarter Italian. I said German, I meant Greek. Quarter Greek, quarter Italian. And then my sister division, who I worked with frequently, they had people from Germany as well as the UK. So kind of like what John was saying, get a Mexican girlfriend. When you get to work with someone every day, you're going to learn more about that culture. So working with the Italians and living in Italy, that combination helped me to understand Italians a lot more. And it was just a great time. Like, I really think if you're able to get a job in another country, like, that is perfection. Just, that's probably the best way to learn a country, because you get to learn about so much more than just like the daily, relaxing life, if that makes sense. You get to learn about the work ethic, which is the foundation for how a lot of countries are. I digress. Okay. John says, you're too young. It was a language school back in the day before apps like Rosetta Stone, etc. I think he's referring to having a Mexican girlfriend. Oh, no, sorry. You're talking about Berlitz. Berlitz is a language school back in the day. Okay. I'm so young. That's what it is. All of this, yeah, I just dye my roots white. Um, but okay, yeah, I give that it could be before my time for Berlitz because I had no idea what Berlitz was. And actually, there's a school in San Miguel de Allende, like a language school to learn Spanish, like an immersion school that is covered by military benefits if you happen to have military benefits and you want to move to Mexico for a little bit. San Miguel de Allende could be one of it. Now, San Miguel is one of the more expensive cities compared to, let's say, San Cris, but it's a college environment, full immersion. Could be a great way to learn language as well. Francie says, lowering our cost as we downsize into our next chapter is key. Yes. Yes. Expanding our outdoor life with a warmer climate means more exercise and better health. All around moving abroad will extend our lives. I really do, like, not that you couldn't do it in the US. Like, let's be honest, not that you couldn't do it in the US. But we talked about the rehab concept. When you travel to a new country, even when you travel to a different state, perhaps, when you just travel in general, but especially a whole new country with lots of cultural differences, it's like going to rehab. It's like going from a world that allows you to smoke and do, eat unhealthy, all of that, and then going into a rehab environment where they don't allow caffeine and they don't allow whatever. It's such a dramatic change that you have to almost make a conscious choice about what you accept and don't accept in your life. You have to make a conscious, like, no, I really need this, therefore I will seek it out. Does that kind of make sense? Like, you end up creating the life that you want for yourself as you travel. And there's an element of learning that happens when you travel. Most people travel to learn, in fact. And so if you're traveling to learn, part of that becomes trying out new ways of living. And it's so much easier to try out a new way of living in a new place, right? Like how many times have you tried something new, but all your friends and family, not that they intentionally wanted to sabotage you, but they're just in the habit of not doing the new thing. So whether you're trying to be a vegan, whether you're trying to exercise every day, they're just not in the habit of supporting that because they're not on the same path as you. And so if you want to hang out with the same people, but have a different lifestyle, this is very difficult to do. But if you move to a whole new country with a whole new set of people, it won't hurt your feelings as much if your friends don't join you in your vegan journey because you don't have friends initially when you move to another country. That sounded a little bit negative there, but my point is the opportunity to change your life dramatically is crazy when you're moving to a new country. It just is. So if you've always wanted to kind of change a lot in your life, travel is a great way. And again, you could do it in the US. You could move to a new state, new city, whatever. So it's not impossible, but it's much easier, I think, when you're traveling to other countries. And I do think there is a materialism generally in the US that is, it's not that it's not there in other countries, but it's a little different. It's a little softer. There's a little, like, I don't know when the US started to get a little crazy, but that crazy has not infected the rest of the world just yet. And I say crazy, listen, it's only crazy for certain people. It's only crazy when you're surrounding yourself with it and watching it all the time and watching the news. And like, you can limit the crazy in the US as well. I don't want to imply that the US is a place you necessarily have to run away from, but just in general, in life, if you want to change a lot of things about yourself, moving to a new country and starting over, it's a great way to do it. It's a great way to do it. And certain places like Mexico makes it much more affordable than certain other places. So Italy, definitely, I lived in Naples, Italy, was more expensive than the US. My job accommodated me for that, right? My job paid me for that, compensated me, that's the word. My job compensated me for that. But overall, it was definitely more expensive to live in Europe. But if you can afford that difference, maybe Europe is the way to go. So these are the pros and cons, I think, for Mexico versus Europe. One other thing that I think is super important. Italy especially, but I get the impression most of Europe, very bureaucratic. Mexico also really believes in paperwork and such. But the difference is Mexico is much more relaxed. Again, we talked about the visa concept. It's a much more relaxed country. generally than all the countries in Europe, quite frankly, as well as the US. And so even though they have bureaucracies, so things like getting a new internet, oh, Karen's here. Hey, Karen. So things like getting a new internet service in your home in Mexico could take weeks to months because of the bureaucracy, because of the paperwork, because of that, and tie that in with the very laid back lifestyle. Italy is the same way, very bureaucratic, but also very domani, domani, dopo domani, which means tomorrow, tomorrow, double tomorrow. But it really just means later. Like when you ask people in Italy, when is this going to happen? When are you going to deliver the furniture I just bought? Oh, domani, domani. Well, like in the future, it could be that same day, could totally be, but more often than not, they just mean a week or so. And they don't, at the time, they don't tell you when. So you kind of have to be home waiting for deliveries. Pros and cons to that. But there is a bureaucratic infrastructure that feels very slow compared to the US, which leans a little on the fast side. Now, I am speaking mostly Southern Europe. My impression of Northern Europe, so like let's say Germany, is that they're much more systematic, much faster, just in general. But overall, Europe, much more slower pace than the US, laid back. There's going to be, from a US perspective, there's a feeling of bureaucracy. There's a feeling of, I must not be hitting all the wickets, which is why I'm not getting the service as quickly. And when you talk to, the various companies that you're trying to do things with, the way they respond is as if, oh, it's because you didn't fill out the paperwork properly, or you didn't fill out the paperwork at all, or this happened. Like there's this feeling of bureaucracy. I think in reality, though, it's just a level of, it's not that important. So we'll get to it when we get to it. And so that's a very different mindset than the US. And I think in Mexico, the way the culture is, they'll tell you more upfront that we're just relaxed. It'll be okay. It'll work out. Don't worry. Whereas in Europe, there's an explanation that will happen that will make you think, oh no, it's because I didn't do the paperwork right. The truth is it's just, it'll happen domani. It'll happen eventually. So my point is just that the level of mental stress for an American is probably going to be higher when you go to Europe because of this slight disconnect in how they answer you. Again, I am focusing mostly on Italy, although I was in Spain for a few weeks, work related, and the language was very similar to Europe, or to Italy. So again, Southern Europe, at least, this is kind of the way they speak. Northern Europe, I hear, is much more, again, systematic and very organized. So you might not have the same problems the further north you go in Europe. Again, and then infrastructure. So depending on where in Mexico you move, there might not be a strong internet infrastructure. Merida, compared to San Cris, let's say, had a better infrastructure. But as people start moving to Merida and the city becomes bigger, their infrastructure is mostly within the city. So anything external to the main hub, if you will, is actively being built right now. And so getting internet in the home of your dreams, which might be further away from the Centro region, this will take time. This will take patience and time, which if at the same time you're trying to have a job, especially an online job, just means you're going to have to go to the center every single day to get your good internet so you can do the job that you want to do and come out, which will cost a little bit more as well. So usually not enough to be that big of a deal, but just the infrastructure in Europe, generally speaking, is and in Mexico is more similar to if you live in a more country or rural area in the US. That's a little more similar to that. So if you're comparing it to kind of one of the bigger cities, and I say bigger, I don't even know exactly how to phrase it, but I would say in my experience in the US, if there's, let me pause and think for a minute. I have family that live in rural parts of the US. Very, very farm environment, country environment. and they don't have Wi-Fi as often. Not to say they don't have it at all, but just they don't have it as much. So a joke Alex will say when we're going to grandma's house is we're going to a place with no internet. They don't have internet. Not true. They do have internet. It's just connected to a laptop somewhere or connected to a computer. It's not Wi-Fi internet. It's not easy to get signal sometimes in these places because there's just not a tower that is nearby enough. So that it happens in parts of the US. I think it happens in, again, rural parts, meaning there's less people there as well. So it doesn't affect as many people. A bigger city or any city that has a significant amount of people in the US will probably have pretty amazing internet. That's the norm. And we have it from a variety of sources enough that it's just not a big deal. We don't think of it as a big deal. But as you travel through rural parts of the US, there are definitely parts that don't have internet. In Mexico, in a city like San Cruz, which has 200,000 people, it's spotty internet. You know, in Merida that has 1 million people, central area is going to have really great internet, but the further away you go, even though you might be in Merida proper, might not have that internet. So there's an infrastructure that is a little less than what you might be used to in the US that you just have to get used to, whether you go to Europe or to Mexico. But generally speaking, I would say Europe has slightly better than Mexico, generally speaking. But if you're moving to have a slower paced life, sometimes not having the internet is the way to go. But if you're also moving to have an online life, meaning your job is tied online, these are things to think about, right? Things to know. All right. I saw a comment. John says, Mexico was a paper bureaucracy nightmare. I can imagine, especially if you're going to school there. I looked at San Miguel de Allende for the language school because I thought, because I can get paid essentially to go to school in Mexico to learn a language that I need help learning. That's epic. And it was the paperwork made me go, no, no. So yeah, Mexico paper bureaucracy nightmare. Everything has to be filled in triplicate. Remember this is very military times, but yeah, I don't want to go back to that. Copy centers flourished around government offices, I imagine. And they were also big on making you submit passport-sized photos for ID. Yeah, Alex's paperwork to go to school, it was not one-stop shop. We had to, obviously, so he had to do a medical screening at a doctor's office or at a clinic. Then we had to go and get professional passport. It was smaller than a passport, but essentially school photos. He had to get those done. And they were very specific about how those get done. He's not allowed to smile, which I think is hilarious. It's very, it reminds me of Japan, actually. Actually, a lot of San Cruz reminded me of Japan. He wasn't allowed to smile. We had to go to a different place to get photocopies of all the paperwork that he needed. And then, of course, I had to have original copies. I had to print the copies in order to make photocopies. It was a very non-digital world. Worth it. It was worth it. I'm glad he had the experience of going to school there, but that was just for a kid going to school who I paid cash, right, for the school, for Alex's school. To then have to go to a system where the U.S. government was going to pay the Mexico school without me being part of it. Yeah, I did not want to deal with that the bureaucracy of that. So again, you will find bureaucracy in both locations, depending on what you want to do. It could be worse or better. Generally speaking, if you're retired, the only bureaucracy you're going to be dealing with is the moving of, the visa paperwork, in which case I would say Europe is much more difficult than Mexico. Anywhere you want to go, though, for anything special, going to school, etc., it's going to be annoying. More in the US, I think it's annoying. In other countries, it's often worse. It is what it is. Healthcare. Tricky subject. So generally speaking, for your everyday routine, and I say routine, so this includes braces, this includes breaking your leg, this includes, needing antibiotics, that kind of thing. In Mexico, I would say it's affordable enough that you're probably just going to pay upfront cash, most likely. But let's say you have a heart attack. Let's say you have something that's just a lot more, you need a lot more specialists to handle it. Then Mexico becomes very much looking at certain cities. There is a reason why some retirees that I met in San Cris, for example, they left. They don't stay in San Cris. There are hospitals in San Cris. So again, when it comes to you break a leg, you get in a car accident, like there are many things San Cris can handle, but they can't handle everything. And they don't have a cardiologist that would specialize in this, right? Or they don't have a doctor that specializes in cardiology kind of thing. So certain specialty items, it's not easy to find in San Cris, in a small town like San Cris, and it will cost significantly more. They're not used to taking insurance. Generally speaking, they're not used to it. Merida, for example, has a much bigger hospital scenario. Mexico City, I'm confident, has a huge, right, hospital scenario. So you're going to be able to get the specialists that you need, and those really, really larger cities are probably much more used to insurance. So again, if you're on a budget, if you need insurance to pay for certain medical scenarios, there's only certain parts of Mexico you can go to, and those places are probably not traditionally budget friendly. So again, San Cris, relatively budget friendly. Mexico City could be as expensive as the US. It won't be literally as expensive, but, well, actually it probably depends on what part of the US you're from. So depends on where you go. And this is things that people have told me. My only experience with medical in Merida or in Mexico is braces related, so dentist related. And then I did break my arm there. I don't recommend it, but so those types of situations, right? Alex had a therapist, physical therapist for a little while because he's got a couple of issues. So all of that type of stuff I found very easy, but I paid out of pocket for all of those things. There were a couple of people that I met in San Cris who loved the cost of living in San Cris, but for any really specialized appointments that they had to do, they initially would go to like Mexico City specifically for the appointment, but they found that the type of service they got, which was more affordable than the US, was also not as, I'm going to use the word comfortable, as the US. So I talked about it a little bit in a video where we talked about like dentists in the US versus dentists in Mexico. They get the same training, or maybe similar, maybe it's more accurate, but they get essentially the same training. So getting your braces in Mexico is the same as getting braces in the US, but it's much more affordable, obviously, in Mexico. But there are little details, right, that you maybe won't get depending on what part of Mexico you're in. And I talked about those differences. Well, that gets escalated when you talk about the other services, right? So there are uncomfortable procedures in the world that some people have to get routinely. And if they are, you might find that the type of service you get in Mexico or other places are not as comfortable as what you get in your hometown. So again, some of my friends that were in San Cris that needed these various procedures would go to Mexico City because it was bigger, so they had the procedures available to them. But they preferred, if they could, to schedule going all the way back to the US a couple of times a year just to have these medical services that was just easier on them. Whether we're going to say it's a mental thing or not, they just found that the service was softer, easier to deal with in the US than in Mexico. And so you saw that happening a lot. Europe, I think this will depend on which country you choose for those types of services, but it will be much harder, let's say, if you do happen to choose a place where they don't take care of all the details that you want them to go back to the US for those. I know I'm being a little bit cryptic here. It's really, I don't want to, anyway, the actual examples I have are very personal to the people who shared them with me, but so I'll give the braces example, or the teeth example. Alex had teeth pulled in the US. He was a child, both scenarios. So in the US, he's had teeth pulled, and in Mexico, he's had teeth pulled because Alex was born with extra teeth. I never heard of it till my son. Anyway, in the US, They had him laying down on the bed. There was a TV screen on the roof that he could look at. So he was watching a movie. They had a screen. So they gave him laughing gas. They had a screen on his nose so he couldn't see his mouth. So they did give him an injection, right, of the Novocaine or whatever, but he didn't see it. He had the laughing gas. He had a topical gel to numb everything, and he had the injection. And then they pulled it. The entire time, Alex was watching a show, even giggling and moving, because, you know, when you watch a show, it's funny, your face kind of moves. So he was doing all of that, no issue. Mexico, they did have a TV, but instead of being on the roof, it's on the side. So his look angle is this way. They don't have a cover for his mouth so he can see whatever instrument is coming into his mouth. They did not have laughing gas. They did have the topical gel to numb the place, and they had the injection. So Alex was crying. He was terrified. He was crying. He was screaming the whole time. It was a much harder experience for him in Mexico than in the US. This is in Merida specifically. And I say horrible. Listen, it's not big picture. It's not that big of a deal. Alex will get over it. But if you hate the dentist and if you hate things happening in your mouth, that those extra little niceties go a long way mentally, right? Like I said, Alex couldn't see what was happening. And I think a lot of why he was so calm was not only the laughing gas, which of course helped, but it was he couldn't see what was happening. So he was watching a show, perfect visibility because it's on the roof or the ceiling. And then like it was a great experience for him. So that's kind of what I mean. Imagine those niceties that you deal with not happening in whatever things that you have going on medically, right? Those are the differences, I would say, for healthcare in Mexico. And if you are in a place that they don't accept your insurance, then you have to pay up front for whether it's a planned service or a emergency scenario. They expect payment that day before they do everything. They'll do a quick analysis to figure out what's happening, but they're not going to help you necessarily with the service you need until they have the money. And they don't just care that you have insurance. They want the insurance to contact them and let them know, yep, here's the check. Here you go. So that they have the money before they start the procedure. So very different medical scenario happening in Mexico compared to the US. Europe, again, you do want to look at the particular country you're thinking of, but it's a little closer to what the US does. And if it's not closer to what the US does, the other option is there are many countries in Europe where healthcare is free and it's kind of for everyone. So might be a gray area if you're a tourist, right? Might not be applicable to you as a tourist, but in terms of residency, at least, you'll fall under, in many of the countries, the same requirements or the same rules as a citizen would, and therefore you can take advantage of the free healthcare. Now, again, free healthcare, it doesn't mean anything you want to have, you can have. That's not what free healthcare means. So we'll do an example. My friend who was Polish, she wanted braces and something else, but her reason for braces was medical. So when you get braces, you can do it just aesthetically. You want your teeth to be straight, but there are also crazy scenarios like Alex having extra teeth. Why? But there are scenarios where you need braces in order to eat properly or to speak properly. Like you need braces. So there's kind of two needs, right? But in Poland, this was several years ago, but they consider braces regardless to be elective and not emergency, not important. So she was put at the back, like she was literally never going to get braces. It would have been free had she waited, apparently, but she was never going to get them because the list is so long for these elective surgeries or elective procedures that she wasn't going to get it. So she actually came to the US, paid out of pocket in the US for her braces. And there was some kind of surgery related to her braces too. Like it wasn't a simple braces thing. But my point is she came to the US so she could have that procedure, whereas in her country, she could not have that procedure. So just keep that in mind when it comes to healthcare, that it's a big deal. It's going to be very personal to your actual situation. So if you're young, if you're healthy, and I say young, if you're 40, if you're 50, if you're 60, if you're healthy and you don't really need anything in particular, then I think this is less of a concern. But if you do have medical concerns, then these are things to look into for sure. And they're different than the US. You can argue that it's better or worse, depending. Generally speaking, it's probably more affordable than the US in a lot of countries, especially because a lot of countries pay for it. But free is not always better, or cheaper is not always better. So just keep that in mind. These are things to ponder. From a Mexico to Europe viewpoint, I think it's you need to know the country, the particular country you want to move to in Europe, to go closer. So from that aspect, there is no Europe versus Mexico. You'd have to go specific country versus specific country. So ultimately, you guys know for me, I chose I chose Mexico first once I was retired and able to choose where to go. Mexico's just easy. It's right next door. Easy to fly to, affordable to live in. It's a great first country to start in if you've never moved to another country. I don't think, if you are privileged enough where you can move to multiple countries, I think that's the way to go. Some people choose to stay in the Americas, so they might start in Mexico, but then they kind of move south from Mexico, and other people move straight to Europe. I will say, of the Latin America countries, from a US perspective, Mexico is the most popular. With good reason, I think. Although, it's the only real country I've ever lived in, so it's hard to know from a Latin America perspective, but Mexico is popular for so many reasons. I think it's a mandatory thing where you just should go to Mexico, at least for a little bit. But Europe is Europe. Europe is so many countries. Europe has and as somebody who prefers cooler weather, Europe also appeals to me. So I do recommend going to both if you can. But the easier, most affordable, chill life would be coming to Mexico. Europe is much more stressful. It's going to be much more costly. It's going to be much more following of rules, which means you have to know the rules for the different countries that you're visiting. So it's a lot more intense, generally speaking. But, all right, so that's my spiel, if you will, for Mexico versus Europe. I would love to know your opinion. If you've been in both, a little bit of each, let me know what you're thinking or your thoughts on that. Again, so it's a personal preference, but Mexico is hands down just the easiest place to go to. So from an American viewpoint, why would you not take a trip to Mexico? I can't think of one. But thank you guys so much for joining me. We will do this live again next week, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And until then, I hope you have a great week.